In this lesson, we'll talk about smoothing out body reliefs. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to create a fillet. At this point in time, we now have the motors and the props inside of our design. So we've created this distributed design where we have components that are located outside of our file that are linked into it. We know that everything clears. We know we have enough room between our landing gear and our prop protection, and we might need to make some final changes on the model depending on how much everything flexes to make sure that we don't run into a situation where we're actually intersecting this. But for right now, I think everything looks good, and we can go ahead and hide both of those motors and props, and we can start to work back on our original design. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start by rounding off these internal corners. There are a few ways that we can do this. Under the Modify dialog, there's something called Rule Fillet. Now it allows you to select input features or faces, and it'll collect all the edges associated with that. Now we can do all edges, we can do against a feature, and we can do all fillets or all rounds. And this will dictate whether it's internal or external geometry. So the way that this works is it allows you to do things like select, and right now it's set to 500, but if we set it to 1, we can tell it that we want it to be against a certain feature. Now, in our case, we don't actually want to use rule fillet because there are certain instances or certain places where we want to use different radius values. So we're going to start by going to Modify and using a standard fillet. We have tangent chain turned on, but it really won't affect us in this case. Now I'm going to start by doing radii on these internal corners that are going to be on the inside section of our mirror. Now sometimes it's easy to select through. Sometimes you might want to hold down the left mouse button to get that selection manager. In our case, we're going to go ahead and add a 5mm radius on these internal edges and say OK. We're going to use our marking menu to repeat that by holding down the right mouse button and dragging straight up. And then we're going to start to collect some of the edges in these internal sections as well. Now again, by default, it tries to grab the face, and depending on where you're selecting, it might be easier for you to come in and actually hold down the left mouse button to get the selection. Now I don't know why by default it's coming in at 500mm, but I'm going to put in a 1 and we'll start from there. So you see here that it's automatically trying to select through and select those bosses instead of this edge. So again, sometimes holding down that left mouse button can help with the selection process. Let's change it to 2 and see how it looks in here. So that's a pretty tight fillet. We can probably even go all the way up to 5 and be okay. After you've entered a value and you've made some selections, you'll need to hold down the Control key to add more edges to your selection. You don't have to do this until you actually enter a radius value, even if there's one that's already preset. But once you do, you will have to remember to hold down that Control key. And again, the selection process is fairly easy going through geometry automatically. But if you ever have a situation where you're selecting through something and you're having trouble, just hold down that left mouse button and it'll bring up the dialog box to select. Now this edge right here actually has tangency, so we don't have to select it. And same thing on the other side. You can select this edge, and this internal edge here, and everything else should already have a fillet. So it's a good check to go to the top-down view, make sure that we don't have any square corners, and everything looks pretty good so far. Now even though we ended up using the same radius value as this feature, that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to combine them. We might want to change the size of this radius later individually. And these corners here, we're going to leave square because we're going to mirror everything across it. So next, let's go ahead and add some fillets to these external edges. And again, we're going to change that 500 down to a 10. And because we already have a selection, we're going to hold down the Control key and make sure that we grab all those external edges. So we should only have 3, one in this corner here, and then the 2 on the front and the back. Let's go to a top view and take a look and see if that 10 is going to be enough. Now if we go out to, say, a 25, it's going to give us a nice curve here. but it might be a bit too much. So we're going to go down to 15, and I think 15 will work okay for us. We'll say okay. And again, these are all areas that you have complete control over. The changing of the radii on these corners isn't going to affect the overall process. At this point in time, we need to make sure that we do have rounded corners just because of how the stress is going to be concentrated on the plastic part. We want to make sure that everything is nice and smooth and rounded. Let's go ahead and go back to a top view. Just do one more check, make sure everything is nice and rounded. Everything looks good. All right, everything looks good. So let's go ahead and save our file so we can move on to the next step.